The federal government officially listed the Proud Boys a terrorist entity today. The neo-fascist group was founded by a Canadian in 2016. Its members allegedly played a key role in the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. The government also named 3 other violent extremist groups with ties to neo-Nazis to the list. Bill Blair is the Minister of Public Safety. He joins us from Toronto. Hi, Minister Blair. Good to see you again. Thanks for making the time.
Of course.
Minister, would the Proud Boys be on this list without the attack on Capitol Hill happening?
Yeah, I believe they would. But let me be really clear. I know that many Canadians and politicians suddenly became aware on January 6th about the risks that this organization represented. But the work of our national security intelligence agencies and law enforcement and our international partners, particularly in the United States, on not just the Proud Boys, but all the groups we've listed today, began years ago. And we've been monitoring their activities, gathering intelligence and the evidence necessary to make this determination that we've announced today. I will acknowledge, of course, that on January 6th, and not just on January 6th, but in the weeks and months leading up to that event throughout the entire U.S. election, there was an escalation. And I think that's the best way to describe it. There was a significant escalation towards violence of a number of different organizations, including the Proud Boys as listed today. And certainly the events on January 6th also provided our intelligence agencies and our law enforcement agencies with a trove of new evidence upon which they could, first of all, provide me with advice. And based on that advice and a very careful examination of all of the evidence and intelligence gathered over the past several years, I came to a determination that it meets the threshold of forming reasonable and probable grounds to believe that organization and others should be listed as terrorist entities. I also had that evidence evaluated by the Department of Justice and received a very positive advice of support for that determination. It's a legal process, Vassy, and not a political one. And I understand the political context of these discussions, but the decision has to be based on law and it has to be based on evidence. And I want to assure Canadians we've done that work. It's also really important because the determination of an organization or individual as a terrorist entity has significant legal implications. And it has to be defensible in law and based on the evidence. And we've done that work.
Yeah, and I certainly have questions about both the politics and the legalities associated with it. But just on the question, when you talk about, for example, an escalation of threats of violence or an escalation of violence, even without that, so I just want to be crystal clear, even without what's happened since the U.S. election and on January 6th, you think you would have arrived at this designation regardless?
Well, I can tell you that the work has been ongoing. Even in 2017, that particular organization had involvement at a demonstration in Charlottesville, where there was deeply concerning activities, not just in rhetoric, but in violence. We saw that again in other large-scale demonstrations in Portland, Oregon, in Seattle, and Washington. We also saw, as events transcribed leading up to the January 6th insurrection, that there were a number of different activities that drew the attention of law enforcement and the careful attention of our national security intelligence agencies, who've been gathering evidence on this escalating threat for some considerable period of time. I will tell you that the evidence that we were evaluating strongly indicated that movement towards violence, they have long been a group known for its hateful rhetoric and their intolerance. And some of their activities, but we've seen an escalation in violence, in the use and acquisition of weapons, in the advocacy of violence against individuals and politicians and others across the continent, which was deeply concerning. And certainly in the totality, that evidence brought us to the preponderance of evidence is more than sufficient to form the reasonable probable grounds.
Right. If that evidence, though, did exist in some form, prior to what's happened, why didn't you make this designation earlier? Does that not open you up to criticisms or characterizations that this is politically motivated?
Well, I think some of the political rhetoric that's been attached to this, and even political fundraising that some have engaged in, I think is unfortunate in that it undermines public confidence in the process. It's one of the reasons I've tried very hard today to explain how important that legal process and evidence gathering is. It is the work of, and I will tell you, Canadians should have great confidence in our national security intelligence agencies, both CSIS and CSE, as well as our law enforcement agencies, including, of course, the RCMP, in gathering intelligence and the evidence required to meet this legal threshold, and also the important advice and work of our Department of Justice. Our officials have been at the forefront of this work. They're not motivated by politics. They're motivated entirely by public safety. They've been doing that work on our behalf. They remain constantly vigilant. I have great confidence in the work that they're doing. I've seen the fruits of their labors. I've had the opportunity to evaluate the evidence and intelligence and in discussions with the Department of Justice to be confident that their work meets that legal threshold for this determination. It's not based on whatever a politician may say in the House of Commons or at a news conference. It has to be based on evidence and the rule of law.
Respectfully, though, Minister, at the beginning of this interview, I asked you, without what happened on January 6th, would you have arrived at this conclusion and made this designation? And you said you would have. So the question still remains, why not make it earlier than now?
Well, and clearly that work has been ongoing for some considerable period of time. But as I hope I also made clear to you, Vassy, the events leading up to January 6th, even before the U.S. election, and then events leading up to January 6th, what our law enforcement and our international partners witnessed very clearly was an escalation towards violence. An escalation not just in the rhetoric, but in actual acts in furtherance of that rhetoric to engage in acts of violence and make very real threats and to take steps to carry out those threats against individuals and institutions, particularly in the United States, but those threats also represent a significant threat to Canadians here and abroad. And so that evidence that was being gathered over those several months contributed very significantly to this determination.
But you still would have made it without it, you said.
No, what I said was that we've been gathering that evidence and the activities were deeply concerning. I also want to be very clear that over a number of months leading to January 6th, there was a continuing escalation of violence. And certainly on January 6th, the activities of the Proud Boys and many others in Washington on that day have provided national security intelligence agencies and law enforcement with a trove of new evidence upon which we can make the determination of these groups as a terrorist entity, and that's what we have done today. I'm not dismissing the importance of the evidence that was available to us as a result of the weeks and months leading up to and occurring on January 6th, but I also want to advise you, Vassy, that this has been on the radar of our security and our law enforcement agencies for a number of different years, increasingly concerning. And now we have the evidence to meet that threshold. Let me also say that there are a number of other significant groups that are also engaged in odious, hateful rhetoric and odious, hateful activities, which are deeply concerning to us. We continue to gather that evidence. The process of listing terrorist entities is an evergreen process. It's not an annual event. And so as that evidence and as those thresholds are met, I am quite prepared to bring forward additional measures of listing additional entities, but it has to be based not on the latest political rhetoric and what's on TV that night. It has to be based on the evidence. It has to be based on the law. And I've got a responsibility to make sure that the evidence and the law are what drive this process and not some other, popular consideration.
You've made a number of references to other politicians who have political considerations here. Which politicians are you referring to?
Yeah, but you know what? I think what's important here is that we are taking the steps that are necessary and are useful in keeping Canadians safe. That's what I'm focused on. And I just want to be really clear because I think it's important. We have to be able to defend these decisions in a court of law. And it's absolutely critical that the decisions we make with respect to the listing of these entities not be based on some political calculation, but rather on the evidence and the law. And I want to assure Canadians that that's exactly how this decision was made, and it was not in any way influenced by anyone's political rhetoric.
Yes, you've made that point, Minister, but in 3 different occasions in this interview, you've also characterized other politicians as being political, right? They just suddenly became aware is something that you said. Who are you referring to?
Well, and again, I don't think it's useful, frankly, in the context of this determination of listing this as an entity. Let me also acknowledge, I understand the political context is this. I understand that Canadians are quite rightfully concerned and became perhaps more significantly aware of the activities of these entities over the past several months, not just on January 6th. And it's quite understandable that politicians would reflect the concern of their constituents and Canadians. And I have that concern too. I also have constituents that I represent, but I want to also be able to assure Canadians that we follow very carefully the legal process that is appropriate and necessary to make sure that the determination of any organization or any individual as a terrorist entity is based on the principles of law and solid foundation of evidence and intelligence.
Yeah, you certainly made that point. I just want to be clear. Jagmeet Singh is the one who introduced this motion in the House of Commons. I know that you said even at the time it would be based on legal considerations and all the things that you've just laid out. But are you saying that he's reflecting his constituents, or are you saying that he's being too political about this?
No. Listen, Jagmeet Singh's a politician. So am I. But what I'm trying very hard to do is clearly defend the legal process, which is founded entirely on the law and on evidence in this determination. It's not a political decision. I understand the political context that exists. I respect the political context that exists, but the process is based on the law and on evidence, and it has to be.
Okay, Minister, thank you for your time. I appreciate it as always.
Thanks, Vassy.
The Canadian government has officially designated Proud Boys a terrorist entity. The decision follows, but is separate from, a House of Commons vote last week that unanimously called for such a move. Public Safety Minister Bill Blair says it was based on intelligence and evidence, not politics. The Canadian government added a total of 13 groups to its list of terrorist organizations, including 3 with ties to neo-Nazis. Leah West is a former national security lawyer in the Department of Justice, now an assistant professor of national security and intelligence at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. And Jessica Davis is a former strategic analyst with CSIS. She's now the president at Insight Threat Intelligence. Both of them good friends of the show, and they join us here in Ottawa. Hi, good to see you. Thanks for making the time.
Good to see you.
I think, Jessica, let me. I think you're both with us still. Jessica, let me start with you. If you could synthesize for our viewers why the Proud Boys would be on a list of terrorist organizations, what would you say?
I would say that they've engaged in a number of different activities that have crossed over from activism or nonviolent extremism into terrorism. Most notably, and the one that everyone's going to be most familiar with, are the events on Capitol Hill, where they engaged in a variety of different activities, destruction, intimidation, threats, all of which help them meet that definition of terrorism in this country.
Just quickly to follow up with you, the minister said that the designation would have happened even in the event there was no January 6th. What do you take from that?
I find that to be a very interesting statement from the minister, mostly because the public designation that they've released to date doesn't mention specifically any other incidents. So from a public perspective, their designation rests entirely on some vague statements about intimidation, counter-protests, and then very specifically on the events on Capitol Hill. So I find those two statements to be a little bit at odds with each other.
Leah, what does it mean specifically for people who support or express support or throw some money behind the Proud Boys? Like, what does this mean for regular people who are watching, not necessarily who do those kinds of things, but are interested in what happens to people who do?
So essentially, by listing the Proud Boys as a terrorist entity, it's now a criminal offense to facilitate or assist the group in their terrorist activity, or really assist the group in anything that it's doing as a group. So to provide funding to the Proud Boys would be facilitating terrorist activity. To provide any matter of assistance could be facilitating terrorist activity. So for supporters of the Proud Boys in Canada, members who pay dues, any provision of funds to the Proud Boys would now constitute criminal activity and actually a terrorist offense.
And so quickly to follow up with you on that point, will it be very consequential? And by that, I mean, will it work to, in your view, lessen the Proud Boys' presence here, lessen their impact in this country, their ability to have impact? What do you think?
I think it could, and more so than in past designations. You may have heard a lot of criticism about the terrorist entity listing not being very effective, and that's to an extent true. But now we're talking about a terrorist group that does have a footprint in Canada more so than most of the previous entities that have been listed. So we do see supporters, we do see members of this organization in Canada in a way that we may not have seen with other entities. So that could have an impact in a way that quite frankly, we haven't seen before. There's also the fact that the assets of the Proud Boys now need to be frozen by financial institutions. And obviously, a lack of funds makes it harder to execute terrorist activity.
Jessica, in order to get listed like this or to qualify or to be labeled a terrorist organization, does the threat to escalation of violence have to occur in this country because the list is, being determined by the federal government here, or can it be based solely on evidence supplied by allies?
It can be based on activities and evidence supplied by allies. So what we've seen in a number of the cases for previous terrorist listings is that activities have taken place outside of Canada, and they still ended up with the groups that perpetrated those acts to be listed in this country. So there's no requirement for that activity to take place in Canada.
Okay. And Leah, I was looking on your Twitter and you had raised some questions about, well, what if Proud Boys have been charged in connection to what happened on Capitol Hill, but not yet convicted. Does that make a difference?
Well, the threshold, the legal threshold the minister kept referring to is when he has to be satisfied on reasonable grounds to believe. That's not the criminal threshold, which is, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So it could be interesting if we see the Proud Boys evade conviction in the United States, where we now have those actions as the basis for a listing here in Canada. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but the fact that we are basing, or at least publicly basing, the listing of the Proud Boys on activity resulting from Capitol Hill attacks on January 6th, where we haven't seen the end result of the criminal result of those attacks, could be interesting. It is unusual in that sense that we're not talking about an attack where an organization has taken and claimed responsibility for a major terrorist attack, and it's very clear that that organization was responsible. We're talking about criminal activity that's still in the process of being prosecuted.
Jessica, last question for you. I was thinking this as earlier today, the White House press secretary commented. She was asked about this designation. She said they were reviewing it. To my knowledge, and you would know much better, but there isn't a parallel system in the United States. There's something they can be listed on, but it's not like they have this exact type of list. What might the U.S. be able to do, though, as a result of reviewing what Canada has now done?
So the U.S. can use the information, obviously, that we've made public about the Proud Boys, but for the most part, their processes are going to be independent of our listing process. For the most of the time, we're not going to consider this to be a legal process for the United States' purposes. However, there are impacts on the individuals who may be in the United States or may have close affiliations with the United States from this terrorist listing. Again, certainly traveling across the border could become a lot more difficult, as could conducting any kind of financial transaction for anybody who's ever been affiliated with the Proud Boys, regardless of whether they're in Canada or abroad.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you very much to both of you. I appreciate the discussion and the expertise. Thanks to Leah West and Jessica Davis. Hi, I'm Vassy Kapelos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.